Reith.
And I'm Kyle Thompson.
This is Ezri.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And this time we're back again with Computer Power and Human Reason by Joseph Weizenbaum. This time we're reading chapters 2, 3, and 4, which 2 and 3 are kind of semi-interesting, but like it's mostly Weizenbaum explaining how computers work to an audience from the 1970s. He has some middlingly interesting points in there, so we're not going to do a in-depth kind of reading of those chapters, but chapter 4 is, I found, to be incendiary and interesting.
Yeah, I think we might as well just jump into it.
Yes,
let's do it.
Can you imagine
where the computer comes from?
An introduction to computer science that just punches you in the guts for being really interested in computers, you fascist.
There's a disdain that runs through this that I found interesting, you know? Like, he is explaining the nuts and bolts. This is the kind of stuff you'd get in a 101 kind of lecture series or something, but he kind of... It's dripping with contempt, which is really interesting.
Yeah, yes. Like, at once, I think we were recognizing that what he's saying is definitely a thing, and then on the other hand, like, it does provide ammunition for a certain, like, you know... that this is some kind of, it's computer science, not hate argument for robots in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Chapter 2, where the power of the computer comes from, kind of starts out with just I guess building up a concept of what are machines? What's interesting about machines? It's the regularity and the complexity and the regularity of the machine that's interesting. He kind of goes through then the kind of, I guess, historical development of machines as things that transfer power to machines as things that process information, miniaturization and kind of computization of processes, which is all pretty interesting. But the point he kind of lays out very clearly initially is that machines operating correctly, what's the quote here? Machines, when they operate properly, are not merely law-abiding, they are embodiments of law. Right? So that when we say a machine is operating properly, it is an embodiment of a certain law, a certain formal system that it is supposed to be enacting, right? And it's against that you can say that the machine is malfunctioning or not. So, I don't know, an engine driving a rotating shaft or whatever, you can see the sort of law that it's supposed to be embodying, and then if it stops or if the shaft breaks or something like that, you can say it's malfunctioning. And the same goes for the computer, right? That if the circuits of the computer are an embodiment of arithmetic, and if they fuck up, they're deviant, right? They're an incorrect implementation of the law. But there is at the heart of it all a kind of concept of a kind of iron law that is embodied in the machine one way or the other.
Yeah, and there's an interesting point where he says that this stretching of the connotative range of the word machine has two quite separable significances. First, it testifies that the folk wisdom recognizes the essential characteristic of the machine to be its relentless regularity, its blind obedience of the law of which it is an embodiment. And that regularity, as the folk wisdom perceives correctly too, has little to do with material motion. This is the insight which permits people to talk of, say, a bureaucracy or a system of justice as a machine. Second, it reveals an implicit, though very vague, understanding in the folk wisdom of the idea that one aspect of mechanism has to do with information transfer and not with the transmission of material power. The arrival of all sorts of electronic machines, especially of the electronic computer, has changed our image of the machine from that of a transducer and transmitter of power to that of a transformer of information. So it's quite interesting that we have this idea of okay, we can build machines according to laws that we gain some awareness of, expect them to perform with regularity, but then also we can draw a conceptual analogy to social systems from machines, right? And And then finally we get the level where the machine is an information processor, and so that kind of metaphor becomes very like physically instantiated as an actual machine and not just a metaphorical one.
Oh, it's like a short rediscovery of like cybernetic principle in the course of his argument. Like,
Yeah, absolutely. I think he uses some examples here of like, you know, in a simple engine you might have, you know, a shaft that rotates and then it like opens a valve or something. But then in a more advanced engine, you kind of replace it with an electrical system that does the same thing. It opens the valve and it's transmitting information rather than transmitting power. Or if I remember correctly, there's the example of like, I guess like, you know, in a primitive automobile, you'd actually turn the steering wheel and it turns the parts of the car. But like, I think these days it's all like electrically assisted steering or whatever. So you turn the wheel and it does computer shit, which then sends signals to the parts of the car to turn, you know. So it's he's just kind of he's kind of abstracting away from like physical motion into information processing as the kind of heart and soul of the machine.
Yeah, that's right. And of course the engine is still a transmitter of power, but we start to increasingly think of it as embedded in an informational system to a degree that like has become quite absurd at this point, right? Like that, you know, everything is so tied into like information communication technologies that link into even something as simple as like an engine or a light switch in your house, right? Like everything becomes embedded into the larger informational machine.
Right. Because it's easier to I think it's easier to build larger and larger machines when they are just information systems. Because like you know, transmitting actual physical power is quite difficult. Like, you know, you can't have like a 30-mile long rotating steel shaft or something like moving power across distance, but you can have electrical signals, you know, do that pretty trivially.
Yeah, well, that's the thing is where like we think about information transmission as somehow not being physical, even though it's like a massive electrical system and often mechanical system. So it's like there's a weird slippage that happens where we start to think of these systems as primarily like ideal and less physical, right? And that's obviously a thing that like, you know, greenwashing by tech companies and stuff takes advantage of. I think I was watching the show Pantheon, which was a like American animated show about uploading consciousness to computers, and like the ultimate justification that this person gives who's like behind the whole thing is like, oh, like our material needs are so extensive as modern humans. The only way that we can escape resource limitations is to become digital consciousnesses who live in like a realm of ideal freedom. And it's kind of like, well, yeah, but you're like leaving out the whole part where this stuff is actually incredibly energy and resource intensive.
Yeah, like it'd be like in you know, in like Mass Effect they have like the AI species of Geth or whatever the fuck they're called, you know, and it's like,
yeah,
imagine being a mind in this kind of ideal realm, and then you have to get into a robot body to go out and mine minerals to feed back into your civilization or whatever, you know what I mean? to keep building bodies or whatever the fuck. You know,
oh Jesus
yeah,
Christ.
People lose sight of that very quickly, right? That it's a material substrate, which is actually really interesting because that's the kind of stuff that Weizenbaum is going to get into. Like,
yes,
that
yeah.
On the one hand, this is an informational monist kind of system, or you can look at it in those kind of monistic terms of like it's all just material. Like, information is patterns among matter. But then he does talk about like how there are kind of like abstract aspects of the machine that like. You know, you could specify a machine that like is, and the specification is, the function of the machine is kind of independent of its instantiation. It does depend on being instantiated, but like he uses the example of like a design for a sewing machine. like the design for the machine itself is kind of independent of the particular construction of a given instance of it. You could make it out of wood, you could make it out of steel in any combination you want, and it still is a sewing machine. So there is something bizarre happening there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We
Well,
can
that's what he means by embodiments of law, right? Is that there's something about a machine that implies its own abstract entity. And you know, he goes on to talk about machines, you know, that can't actually be instantiated, but you know, they exist in this abstract way. But it's part of it because of the lawfulness that it presupposes. I don't know if we've read this on air, but this is a good one. We expect an ordinary desk calculator, for example, to be an embodiment of the laws of arithmetic we all know. Should it deliver what we believe to be a wrong result, our faith in the lawfulness of the machine is so strong that we usually assume that we made an error in punching in our data. It is only when it repeatedly malfunctions that we decide that there is something wrong with the machine, quote unquote. We never believe that the laws of arithmetic have been repealed or amended, but neither do we ever believe that the machine is behaving capriciously in an unlawful manner. No, in order to restore it to its proper function, we seek to understand why it behaves as it now does, of what law it is now an embodiment. We are pleased when we find, say, a broken gear that accounts for its aberrant behavior. We have then discovered its law.
Well, and this is like one reason why I think we're so fascinated with like language learning models is because they do behave capriciously, and also we can't provide an account of why they don't work. So like you can't come up with the lawful explanation for why it didn't work because you can't even get into the guts of a black box, right? And
it's too complex.
And so it breaks these assumptions we have about what it is to be machinic. And therefore is just kind of like perplexing and fascinating to us, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Moving on to like page 44 or so, he kind of moves on to like, again, into this abstraction, like that these abstract machines and specifications, you know, kind of live in the same realm of like, this kind, like you could kind of specify anything. Like it's an infinite field of games that we can play, an infinite set of rules that we could possibly imagine. Now, if you're talking about like physically building, you know, sewing machines and shit like that, you are kind of constrained by what can be constructed. But in the realm of the computer, you know, you kind of have this, or in the realm of like formal systems and rule sets and stuff like that, you can kind of go nuts if you want, right? Like go completely off the rails.
Yeah, you're only constrained by what can be articulated and simulated, right? Like it's like, you know, a machine you built, like there's the joke about like, oh, well, this rocket I designed worked in Kerbal Space Program, so it must work in reality, right? Well, of course not, because it's a very simplified physical model and you can't expect it to work in the real world, but it will work in Kerbal Space Program, right? It's the according to the laws of that simulation, it's perfectly fine. And you know, these are different things, right? And you know, maybe your computer isn't fast enough to run the program, and so you can't do the simulation. But assuming you have the capacity to simulate, assuming you have the capacity to articulate, you can do it. In the virtual, right? He's talking about the virtual is what he's describing. Is you know, it's something that predates computers because obviously the virtual always existed as long as we had like imagination and language, but it becomes something that's like very, very commonplace with computer simulation.
He's talking about purely abstract games and purely abstract rule sets that have no contact with the real world, that they're not dependent on the real world. One of the examples he uses is the game of chess. You might play chess with wooden pieces or ivory pieces, but it doesn't really matter. The game of chess is purely abstract. You can play it in your mind, you can play it on paper. It doesn't really matter what way it's instantiated. It is a consistent and coherent thing in itself, an abstract machine, an abstract game. And he points out a very interesting thing, that like the rules require, they're just pure calculation and there's no judgment, right? When you ask if like a move is valid in chess, no judgment is involved. It is purely a matter of calculation of whether this is a valid move or not. There's no subjective or aesthetic concern or anything like that gets mixed into it. It is a purely mechanical system, all of its own.
Chess players will refer to a valid, like the best strategy as correct, as a correct response.
A lawful move, you know?
Yeah, and they have a quasi-logical, like, or paralogical, I suppose, like notation. Like this, they have like mathematical chess notation.
They have an algebra or something, you know?
Yeah, it's like it's a very elaborate, like it's an unsolved game, but it has very elaborate game, like proto game theory built into the culture of chess. It's like a really interesting cultural development. That they have this level of theory about it.
This was really interesting to me as a game designer because tabletop role-playing games are both abstract and also do not behave like this. They involve a lot of judgment, but they're still just as abstract as chess. So it's just a different kind of game. The more freedom you introduce into the game, the more judgment gets involved, right?
Well, I guess for the chess thing, it's like the judgment of the players is involved, but I think specifically he's talking about like there's no judgment in interpreting the rules, I guess, which is not true of, say, Dungeons and Dragons or whatever, where like the game master does get to interpret the rules and gets to exercise judgment on things.
Well, there's also just like aesthetic judgments, right? Like, oh, should I take the story in this direction? Does that conform to the principles of the game? Blah, blah, blah. Like,
is this fun?
Even in sports, when you talk about where something is sportsmanlike or not, right? Like that's something that you can have in abstract games, as well as, physical sports.
Absolutely. But the thing that Weizenbaum was interested in here is this property of there being no judgment in the interpretation and application of the rules. This means that to ask if a move in chess or a configuration is valid is really to ask if it can be reached, if it's a configuration that can be reached by application of valid rules starting from the initial board state. So, like, can you concoct the sequence of moves that would lead there? And that would then exclude a space of board configurations that are unreachable and therefore invalid and so on. So this brings us to the concept of like the state of the game and state transitions as being the things that make up this abstract machine. So you have the current state, and you have all possible transitions, and then the branching tree of all possible moves through all possible states is the totality of the game.
I think there's a very famous piece of like Japanese fiction from like the mid 20th century that is about I think it's about Go, and the story is essentially about instrumental versus substantive reason in a sense, or even like the humanity of playing one of these games as a means of communication between two people versus playing the game as a abstract game made up of state transition rules, and like the sort of like the violation of humanity that is implied in modernity through playing the game in a way that like breaks the common human understanding. I wish I could remember the name of the story, but is definitely has to do with this issue.
Yeah, totally. If you can find it, we'll put it in the show notes. That'll be great.
Yeah, for sure.
But the Weizenbaum kind of moves on. He does kind of admit this difference between permissive and deterministic games, right? Like that. There are some games that are really just procedures, and he kind of goes through where like the result is static, like it is deterministic, but it is unknown at the start, so he has this illustration of like a game played with an ashtray and some marbles, whatever the fuck, and it's actually a way of figuring out what time it is or something. But it's an exceedingly boring game because there's no actual play. It's just application of rules from one state to the next. Whereas chess has more creativity going on.
This is a thing that comes up a lot in game studies, right? Is that play is something that is not identical to gameplay. it's something that exists in a broader sense than games. And there's like, you know, whole long books written about the distinction between these two things. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We're kind of breezing past a fair bit of stuff here, but it is quite wordy. It's just like, and it is interesting to read. It's just not so chewy to talk about. But he moves.
Well, yeah. For instance, time in chess is technically something that, you know, departs from abstraction and like this abstract notion of game, because time is, of course, as we covered last time, a reference to solar, like planets moving around like stars and shit. So that's not abstract enough for what he's talking about.
Yeah, right. Like the formal definition of chess doesn't have a time component, but like the actual playing of it does. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a game time you can have in chess if you don't play on a clock, where the game timeline is made up of discrete moments, and they exist independent of lived time or clock time. Right? They just happen according to like a series of numbers.
Baby. Yeah.
It's yeah.
I guess he moves on to like definition of like algorithm as effective procedure, like that if you have this kind of way of fully defining the states and the transitions, you have an effective procedure, therefore you have an algorithm. And this is the kind of thing he's going to be, he's doing comp sci 101 sort of stuff, but it is good stuff if you're not familiar with it. A lot of there's an interesting page then on page 47 of like about the agent that's carrying out the procedure, right? That like there's always this assumed agent. Like when you specify a procedure, there's an assumed agent that's going to be carrying it out, and the degree of the effectiveness of the specification really depends on the agent, right? So that like he's kind of talking about like, you know, a cookery school or whatever, and it's like it trains students to a high standard to be able to perform these procedures, to be able to follow recipes. But the recipes don't really make sense to people who aren't trained, you know what I mean? Like, so when you give the recipe to a trained cook, it is an effective procedure, but if you give it to someone like me, it's not, you know? That the specification of the algorithm is always in reference to an agent, whether the agent is a human being or, you know, an ARM processor or whatever. There's always like something else that you're talking to, that you're saying, pick up this, do this, move it here, move it there. You're kind of relying on the agent to be able to interpret the instructions correctly.
Yeah, like you have some understanding of like processor's instruction set, like their fundamental instruction set, and how to interface with that, right?
Which I guess is always this interesting thing when people get really hung up on like algorithm as this highly powerful sort of thing, and it's like, well, where's the agent that's carrying out the algorithm, right? You know, and it's how powerful is that agent? You know, is it an ARM processor with this wonderful instruction set and, you know, whatever, or is it a potato, or are we talking about a professional chef or just some dullard? You know, like.
The algorithm at best is referring to like the entire institutional like incentive structure of a particular platform. That is, you know, that's there's a defined function for it. That's not how it is used in common life, where, you know, it might as well just be the Jews.
Yeah, algorithm in the Twitter sense here, yes, and the social media sense.
Yeah. So, you know, just as an algorithm veteran myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've all been through the algorithm wars, you know.
Yeah. Information is more real than flesh. I mean,
it sounds like the Butlerian jihad from Dune, you know?
Right.
Oh yes, we all remember the algorithm wars.
Yes, exactly. Well, like, so there is something he outlines here that like this is what would stimulate a Butlerian jihad, right? That like when we have this impulse to specify effective procedures, there is an impulse to specify and make the language precise so that it admits no variation in its application, right? That like the application of the procedure would be always and unambiguously result in exactly the same outputs regardless of the agent carrying it out. And so it erases human variety, right? Like you kind of a set of rules for baking a cake that specified absolutely everything down to the last micron you wouldn't even need a human agent to carry it out. Why bother with a human cook anymore? Just have a machine 3D print the fucking cake at that point,
Yeah, it's how you get like highly processed food, right? It follows with the logic that like the more abstract and law-like the algorithm is, the less judgment is involved.
Yeah, that's it. But there's a tension then with like how we don't have unambiguous language, like largely like in the realm of natural language, we don't have unambiguous language. We're always kind of frustrated in this effort. And we find that we can't nail things down precisely. But we do have formal languages, which are like games. And we're back to the games thing, right? If we have this driving desire to ultra-specify a procedure, we're like, shit, English just isn't going to fucking do it. We need a formal language. We need something that resembles a game with unambiguous procedures, like unambiguous phase transitions like in chess. That's how you get here.
Yeah, I'm trying to think to myself, are we all on board with these types of things being languages? Because, in my more naive state, before like getting into what other people thought about this, I would say to myself, well, people say math is a language, but is it really? Like, it doesn't have the vagueness of language. Like isn't the vagueness central to what makes language? Like,
I basically agree, like in that sense, but like the horse is bolted on this, I guess, for the colloquial understanding.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I'm just like, I was surprised to see people making this argument while still giving up this rhetorical point. Listen, it's okay, language, sure, formal language, fine.
There's this thing like where I spent a good while a couple of years ago like studying parsers, like how to parse programming languages, how to parse data structures and stuff. And the thing with parsers is like you very quickly run into like Noam Chomsky's work on like computational linguistics and stuff like that. And the funny thing is that like he set out to try to figure things out about natural language, but his work ended up being much, much more useful in computer science, and it basically didn't touch natural language at all, really. But then everyone who teaches you parsing will say, oh, blah, 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 let's write a parser for this language. And then they'll say, also, by the way, these aren't really languages. Like, language is just a weird borrowed word that we have that we borrow from the concept of natural language. But, like, JavaScript isn't a fucking language, in quotes, in that sense, So there is, at least I found in the comp-sci world, there is a sort of ambient understanding that the word language is stretched here.
It's stretched. I mean, I think the thing is that when we speak about formal language, it makes me think about essentially what he was referring back to earlier, the idea of like the regularity of bureaucracies and the standardization of languages as nation building, as state building, right?
Yeah, customs.
And I think that because we went through language standardization, like basically enforced reduction of variety in human language in order to form these nations, like, famously the construction of the French language or whatever, right? It's easier to accept these things as being languages because they tend to share more sort of these sort of like quote unquote formal properties, where you can say that there is the vernacular, there is dialects, all these kinds of things. But like if you want to talk about the French language, you refer to the official sanctioned French language, or in Japanese you call it like hyojungo, is this like synthetic thing that's been created for nation building, and so it has a kind of like algorithmic quality to it. But I don't think they're identical. I just think that the mediation through bureaucracy and states encourages the conceptual slippage between these different things. Yeah,
you can certainly see where it came from. That's a really good connection. But yeah, like over the next couple of pages, like Weizenbaum moves on to basically saying, like, if you have a formal language in which to describe a game, then you have a machine, right? Like, you have an abstract machine. These are all the same concept. A game, a language, and a machine are all basically the same thing. And he moves on to this very, like, coy sort of, like, explanation of the Turing machine without giving it that name initially. He describes a game played with a roll of toilet paper and, you know, black marbles and white marbles and all these rules for, like, moving the marbles around on the toilet paper and whatever the fuck. Yeah, and there's a little dice. It's all good fun. But in the end, he has these wonderful illustrations, and he has a table of, like, the state transitions and all this good stuff. But, like, what he then ends up with is that, like, if you zoom out and you look at what's happening here, this is an adding machine. It is doing addition. You have a situation where you look at, like, 3 black marbles, a white marble, and then 2 black marbles, and then the machine state transitions move the marbles to be together, so it makes 5, and it's addition, right? Like 3 plus 2 is 5. If you zoom out that far and you understand what the rules are doing. Notably, there's those kind of levels of interpretation. Like, one could sit there and follow the rules of the game and move the marbles around without ever understanding that it was doing addition. You'd have to step up a conceptual level to be able to see that. But yeah, it's a way of illustrating the Turing machine and algorithm and the role of the agent in playing out these things. And the fact that, you know, you can describe an adding machine as a set of rules, yeah, as a game to be played. Which, I mean, it's cool stuff, you know. It's kind of cool. Comp Sci 101, but it is pretty good.
Well, he has a little bit of a poetic flair that's usually missing.
He does. It is fun to read. It then gets more interesting when it becomes recursive, right? That, like, if you have this way of encoding information on a tape, then you could encode the rules of the game on the tape, you know? And now you've got into proper Turing machine kind of territory where you could take the state transition table, turn it into configurations of black and white marbles and put them on the tape, and then have a different region of tape that's the actual number data that you're working on, and then you could shuttle back and forth between the rules and the data, and it would become a self-contained system at that point. At that point, the tape would be a program plus its data that it would operate on. Yeah, it's a Turing machine. That's Turing shit, you know.
And yeah, and as he says, I am saying then that there exists a Turing machine that operates on a tape containing only ones and zeros, and that is capable of imitating any other Turing machine, whatever. This so-called universal Turing machine is, as are all Turing machines, describable in terms of a set of quintuples of the form we are already familiar, i.e. the current state, the symbol read, the next state, the symbol written, and the direction of tape motion. So if you have that, it's you know, it's a U machine, right? It's a universal machine that can emulate or run any other Turing machine.
Yeah, it's a game that can play any game.
Yeah, one of the greatest triumphs of the human intellect.
It is. It's incredible stuff.
Which is it's nice. Like, can we just appreciate how that coexists with all the dour stuff about programmers later? Like,
this is the thing, right? Like, computation as a kind of mathematical field is just a fucking miracle. You know, it's a wonderful place. And then the actual practice of programming is just pissing things up a fucking wall, doing, like, ads and Bitcoin and shit like that. You know what I mean? It's like computation is wasted on us, you know?
And it seems to coincide with, like, our, like, I don't know, being ground down to the most behaviorist, like almost biologically, like, conditioned kind of version of humanity that you could get in a mass society instead of what it obviously could also sustain, and, you know, what we might have been hoping for.
Yeah, well, because there is the small detail that although the Turing machine is an abstract machine and you can instantiate it on toilet paper with rocks, it generally helps to have really big computers to run these machines, and whoever owns the most of them has a lot of social power.
Absolutely, right. And it's a fun thing to be reminded of, because like when I open my laptop and I like click on Spotify or whatever, I don't think of it as being, I have a universal machine and then I make it transform into a Spotify machine temporarily, by loading the Spotify program, and then later I load up Discord and it transforms into a Discord machine. But that is what's happening. It's fucking crazy, right? That like the code of those two programs specifies a machine, like a Spotify machine and a Discord machine, and then this universal machine just like mutates into them when it like loads the data. It's fucking insane stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's really, really fascinating.
And it's this universality of the computer, right? The Turing machine, that is its most alluring and sort of most dangerous aspect, right? That like it looks like it can do fucking anything. But it can do procedures that can be realized on Turing machines. So like the universal Turing machine is still not a universal machine. There are programs, or there are things that cannot be Turingized. But if you have an effective procedure, a Turing machine can carry it out for you. That's the universality of it. And so if you can play around in the great sandbox of possible effective procedures, then you can stay within a world in which everything seems possible, just so long as you don't go looking outside the sandbox for things that are not in that set of things that are formalizable. And again, formal languages, formal games, things with well-defined state transitions, that's what we're talking about here.
Yeah, and then you enter kind of metaphysical place, which, or at the very least, in a sort of an epistemological, but also nature of the knowability of reality. So a nice intersection between metaphysics and epistemology.
It's not a far jump.
You enter this disjunction where either the Turing machine can handle everything or it cannot, and whether anything that exists in principle could not be disaggregated into the Turing machine. Obviously the Turing machine will never, let's say, it cannot identify, the halting problem will jam it up, but it, arguably it might be able to algorithmically approximate the ways that humans identify an infinite loop and stop themselves from doing things. So, arguably there's a way in which the whole conversation moves and will continue to move because of the structure of the disagreement. In staring at this, I eventually saw this undecidable disagreement in intuition, and in talking to people about it, there is just going to be this version of, now that this is introduced, there's just going to be this version of epistemology that believes that all of human reality is fundamentally knowable in that, in this way, and there's a group of people that do not think this.
Yeah, it's the split described in chapter 1, right? That the split that Weizenbaum observed in the MIT labs or whatever is just there's people who seem to think that literally fucking everything about human beings is formalizable in Turing terms, and there's people who don't, and it's just a fundamental split,
No, this has really been impressed on me over the last during the phase where we didn't record, and having a lot of conversations with people about it. This is very much a do you think free will is real kind of deal. And it's also related to questions on, I meant that in terms of a category of undecidability, but also I should say it has it's related to behaviorism in general, and the willingness to think about what's in the black box.
Oh yeah, we just get these three categories of things that cannot be answered with the Turing machine, right? Can anything we wish to do be described in terms of an effective procedure? The answer to that question is no. So there's three types of things that are not possible to describe in terms of an effective procedure. First, there are certain questions that could be asked and for which it can be proved that no answers can be produced by any effective procedure whatever. We may, for example, be interested in knowing whether some machine we have designed, say our adding machine, will halt when started with a particular data set. It would be convenient if we had a testing machine which could, for any machine and any data set appropriate to it, tell us whether that machine operating on the given data set would ever halt. No such machine can be built. So that's a limit. That's a logical limit. Then there is effective procedures or algorithms that can be capable of making some calculation in principle, but it would take such a long time to complete it that it's effectively worthless. So this is either a problem of, well, essentially it's a problem of computational power, and there's just like a limited amount of power in the universe. And so there are things that are like simply impossible on those grounds, even beyond just like practicalities to like literal impossibility. And then finally we have the procedures realizable by a Turing machine, but whose rules do not include an effective halting rule. So everybody is pretty familiar with these, right? Like you run a program, it doesn't have a halting rule, and then the computer just freezes because it's just doing the rule forever. And therefore it never produces an answer because there's no halting rule. It's kind of like you're not actually asking anything, you know? Like it's like the initiation of a consideration, but without any specification of what it is.
Yeah, there's no return statement at the end. You just go into an infinite loop and then sit there forever, and it's just a black box that gets warmer over time.
Yeah, and there's just an obvious like human. It's not the same as a human running the Turing halting problem. Like the Turing, like. It's not like if, you know, a human behaves as a Turing machine and runs the halting problem, they can overcome it. We just have like other stuff going on so that we can see around the formal process. Like, and probably all the stuff I was saying before should have come after Kyle reading all that about the halting problem, because that like Weizenbaum is of course saying no, like don't be stupid, like come on, but you know. In practice, in conversations, most people collapse all of these categories into the second that, like, listen, we just don't have the power yet. Like, once we have the power, everything else will melt away. Well, not the formal logical fallacies, but the ways that humans are able to, get beyond that sort of thing. Like the human heuristics will be quantifiable and decomposable. There's a...
Yeah, I mean... This is why when Beer talks about this issue, he says, like, look, you know, even if in principle we could reduce everything to the second one, there's a limited amount of energy in the universe, and therefore, like, there are hard limits even to this in principle problem. Like, like no matter how much efficiency and energy capture you're able to do, like there are many things that are simply beyond calculation.
Yeah. It kind of comes down to this question that he calls out very explicitly, like, are all decision-making processes that humans employ reducible to effective procedures and hence amenable to machine computation? Are all of them? No. There we go.
Well, like, I think ethical intuitions are just like, it's, if you've ever witnessed analytical philosophy, it's like you can see that there's been a, you know, some sort of category error. Not that people shouldn't try to logically kind of think about their and intuition pumps and all that stuff. That all has, you know, like helped me clarify a few things. But like, you just have intuitions, and like you can kind of reason with yourself about it, but you have them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Weizenbaum talks a bit about like the kind of downfall of some of these things that like like formal languages have this property of being able to kind of apply these like syntactic transformations, but like natural language doesn't have that. You know, like you are dealing with not just like data structures, but you're dealing with meaning and value and such, like in kind of natural language. And, you know, he's just kind of trying to highlight the problems of like, hey, look, there's this stuff that's not amenable to formal language and formal systems. And there's so much going on in humanity that you can't apply blind transformation rules to. Like, it's just, if you do that, you just do violence to the thing and you mangle it. You know, I think he uses some kind of example of like a novel that's written in such a way that like it's a mystery murder detective novel or something, and it hinges on the gender of somebody and like some ambiguous statement that's made about them or whatever, and it's like you can't just apply a transformation rule to that text and then still preserve the fact of it being like a mystery with a good reveal and resolution and all that kind of stuff. Like it would actually mangle the content to apply a kind of algebraic transformation to the text.
Yeah, for me, this comes in when thinking about, you know, if we're thinking about a bureaucracy as a machine, then, you know, the bureaucratic maintenance of the revolution. Like, this is one of those, the reason why people like positivism in those elements is that we can just kind of bracket out that whole level of meaning that's lost in the preservation of all these, you know, aesthetic and like power like processes. Like you're replicating all this stuff, but clearly something is lost in the institutionalization of a revolution that coincides with the dying down of the popular upsurge, right? Like, and you know, the state slogan in Connecticut is still revolutionary. Like,
yeah,
you know, the revolution from like the 70s, 70s, whatever. Like, yeah, like the meaning is lost in machines over time. Like that's why there's these like a fetish for the, you know, kind of these big moments where people come in and like there's mass energy, and when you see that mass energy dwindle away, the symbols lose their meaning. Like there's just whole levels of human reality that can't be captured if you don't appreciate the difference between, you know, algorithmic content or algorithmic structure, algorithmic logical like processing and meaning, like, which I guess comes naturally to people that are swept up in history, and less because the whole thing is how do you like encode this in the record? Like that's the historian's big question, and you know and to some degree social scientists will often not ask the question, you know, even though they should. Like whereas if you're like a proper STEM person, I don't know, maybe it just doesn't occur to you the same way.
Yeah. The last couple of pages are kind of interesting in this chapter. Like, he's still hung up on this kind of thing of like, can human decision-making processes be described unambiguously and even in natural language? And in some cases, yes. Like if we have like shared vocabularies and highly conventionalized contexts and like very narrow kind of technical language, then we can have these kind of shared understandings and like formalize things. Like I guess legalese is an example.
Yeah, like how to prepare and serve a hamburger at McDonald's.
Right, totally. And that relies on the agent kind of being inducted into a world of shared understanding to be able to interpret the vocabulary correctly. Which these I get, you know, it's for this variety engineering thing of like having these highly standardized vocabularies that restrict the context and enable us to talk about things in this way. He's a super interesting kind of like little line here then, I think at the bottom of page 71. He says, after all, since we can all learn to imitate universal Turing machines, we are by definition universal Turing machines ourselves. That is, we are at least universal Turing machines. Which is a very interesting little admission. Yeah, but he's right. Like we were at least that. That's the...
Well, it's a crucial admission because, you know, whenever you get into one of these arguments, people are like, what, you think you're not a machine? You're a machine, you know? Like, well, yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. Like, sure. Like, period. Like, case closed. Like, if I algorithmically tried to solve the halting problem, I wouldn't be able to do it.
Yeah.
Like,
and then there's this. He brings in Polanyi, saying that we know more than we can tell, and this seems to be one of these really crucial kind of tripping points, right? That like, even if we know something and we can perform it and stuff, we might not be able to tell the computer in an effective procedure how to do it. And even with large language models and stuff, which is kind of getting closer to that, being able to tell it what to do, it's still not there, right? Like, it still doesn't have the shared understanding. It won't be able to flip a burger at McDonald's because it's not an agent that can be inducted into this shared understanding and be told in these kind of these terms, really. And that's one of these really crucial problems, right? Like, we can know, but can we tell how to do it? How to do this stuff?
Yeah, and then there's also like ineffable things. Like, we can sort of know, but not fully know, and also can't tell. I've had this experience like in meditation. Like the other day, I was doing meditation and I was trying to articulate something, and it was like I would have sentences that would come to mind, but there were words in the sentences, like the sentences would have a grammar, and there were words in the sentences that weren't words. They were like, how would I describe it? Like pictures and sounds and emotions, but there was no word for them. But they still fit into a sentence structure as a like object. So that was kind of, yeah, that's sort of like the ineffable, right? Yeah, and know of it but not know it.
Yeah, I think in my brain it kind of manifests as often like it's yeah, there's clear words, there's that, and then the did the it's just these textures that kind of take the place of words, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely, which is, I think, probably a universal experience, but it is weird. But then it's, again, this weird thing of like something you know but you can't really tell. We could probably have this conversation for hours. I don't think we'd really get anywhere with like really having a certainty that we have exactly the same experience of these things. It's ineffable, you know?
Yeah, and it's not exactly even knowledge, because like you can't capture it, you can't necessarily recall it, you don't know it in detail. Like it's very fuzzy as just experience without depth of knowing.
But yeah, no, I was thinking about how this level of the ineffable kind of incommensurate differences between people, and like, you know, stuff that's either just rationally undecidable, which means a truly rational, like an actually rational humanist wouldn't have like a strident enlightenment like defense of their side. They would more or less kind of have to open themselves up to indeterminacy. Like and just, you know, taking that step in rationalism where you're like, okay, people are not going to like just convince each other, except, you know, unless there's something like the Big Bang that changes a metaphysical debate. But even then, it just changes the metaphysical debate. It doesn't get rid of it. It just shifts around because there's just a stable disagreement. So there's that level, and then there's the level of like, it's actually really hard to reconstruct almost everything that humans care about, which is, again, what makes it really hard to lose somebody is that you can't just upload them. Like, you can't upload all this cool stuff, and why the, you know, as much as I want there to be like data stream transporters or something, like there, you know, this sort of is a fantasy of like preserving people as if they're data, and it just I don't know, categorically, it's got me. Like, it's got me. I'm really in like a different headspace, and unfortunately, like when I talk to people about this, they're like, well, what you're saying is like in the same level of like the unknowability of God or something. It sounds really mystical, and it's like, you can't really argue that it's not. Like, there is just like this level of, you can't know it. That's all mysticism is saying you can't really like know something. Like,
yeah, and, you can have an experience of something without really knowing it. Yeah,
and it wasn't until like getting familiar with mathematical standards of argument that I really thought about like, well, you can actually sometimes prove that, you know, that you can't do something, and you can. And
yes,
Like there are, yeah, I don't know. It puts all of the other disciplines in perspective. To have that standard, to have a rationalistic conjecture standard, like, so a lot of other rational disciplines essentially lack this, but really want to be math. Like, and so, yeah, getting a sense of where these things, like, this is what analytical philosophy pretends to teach people, but it doesn't. It doesn't really do that. Like, I took analytical philosophy. I didn't learn this until I was, studying math proofs. I don't know why.
Right.
Yeah, interesting. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mean stuff like the like the halting problem, like Gödel's incompleteness, like where you have a proof that this is actually unknowable. This can't be done.
Well, that and just the I feel like this is based on nothing, but I feel like the level of mathematicians that feel like that everything is reducible to math versus the level of like analytical philosophers that think everything is reducible to algorithms, data, mathematical objects. Like mathematicians probably think it less. Just like maybe like half of them. I don't know. Like maybe, or rather than a majority, like a significant majority, where it's in a lot of the logical encoding kind of sides of analytical philosophy, with the exception of pragmatists that do not, that are essentially a counter-analytic tradition, but are usually like sort of, I don't know, like they're still highly influenced. It's more like a post-analytic tradition. They're highly influenced by the analyticals, but they have to argue on their turf with pragmatic arguments or whatever. Like, so like American pragmatists is what I'm thinking of. Like, yeah, I guess, I don't know, aside from that. Anyway, big philosophical speedball, but I love that this book touches on this stuff and gets me to reconsider why, I don't know. As you get old, you start to look at the concept of God differently, even if you've been an atheist. You just start thinking about yeah, but isn't there something some kind of how would I know? You can't know. My cultural conceptions of God are definitely wrong. That's what the
that's what's very
we've known that for 100 years.
That's very frustrating about conversations about God, is that the term is very loaded in a way that makes you want to be an atheist, because it's come on. This is silly.
It's a rational. It's a rationalist. It's like a trap, where it's the whole thing is this pan to irrationality. So fuck that. But then when you really think about it, there's no data.
Thank you for listening to General Intellect Unit. While you wait for the next episode, you can find us on Twitter @GIUnitPod. You can find us on Facebook and all the podcast apps. If you'd like to support the show, get access to our community Discord, and help keep the lights on, then go to patreon.com/generalintellectunit and give us a couple of bucks a month. Every contribution is greatly appreciated. This show is part of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast network and research collective. Go to emancipation.network and check out our sister shows such as Swampside Chats, From Alpha to Omega, Jumpsuit Utopia, and Mortal Science. They're excellent shows and excellent folks. As always, thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope you'll join us again next time.